Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining from. And welcome to today's webinar. This is the fourth chapter in our Knowing Your Assets Value series. Today, we're going to talk about how to work with imperfect analogs and address the strategic question, what share of my target population will I achieve? Thank you for joining today. My name is Jeff Olive. I'm the founder and CEO of P3I Consulting. Just a couple of quick logistics for today. The session is being recorded for future playback and will be posted on our website, p3iconsulting.com. And there will be time for a short Q&A at the end of the discussion. So just a little bit about P3I. We specialize in using financial models to enable confident decision-making in spaces that range from BD&L to launch forecasting to P&Ls and long-range plans. We believe the value of working with us is that we'll help you articulate the economic value of your clinical and commercial strategies, and that you'll have a deeper understanding of the market and product landscape. Services we provide, there's three pillars. One is obviously financial modeling, a second for analytics to help inform uncertainties and how you manage them, and a third for services that span training to objective assessments and process redesign. Again, my name is Jeff Olive. I've been in the industry for over 20 years. Prior to founding P3I, I was at EQRx, which was a biotech startup. There, I helped inform launch sequencing plans and also did work that informed clinical trial design. Prior to that, I was at Merck for many, many years, but perhaps most notably, I led the development and scale up of Merck's global oncology forecasting capabilities. I also have other experiences in other therapeutic areas and other functional areas like insights and analytics. But on to today's strategic question. What share of my target population will I achieve? So first, let's quickly level set on why we use analogs and what are the benefits. By far, I think the most common application of analogs is they help us predict market share. And here the assumption is that the way the market responded in the past is likely to happen again or repeat again if patients, payers, and providers were given similar choices. So it's kind of different than the commercial we often hear where past performance doesn't predict future performance. Here we're actually saying past performance predicts future performance. On top of helping us understand market share, analogs can also be used for a lot of other applications. Some of them include, how do I plan for a new dosing option? What's the impact of a new indication? And for those areas where unfortunately we do struggle with stocking issues, how long might it take to recover the share that we lost when we were having the stocking issue? And just to level set, this will be a handy tool for us down the road. The ideal analog for a launch product represents a marketing environment that's similar to the one we're going to launch into, and for a product that is similar to what ours would look like. Analogs are also the first place people tend to look, and that has a lot to do with the benefits. So let's talk about three key benefits that I identified. One is real-world adoption. Two is relatively easy access to data. And the third is just ease of use. So when we talk about reflecting real-world adoption, analogs are great because we know it happened. It's not a market research exercise where it's opinion. It's not a marketing colleague's opinion on what could happen. It's not a medical director's opinion. It actually happened, it's measurable, and we can report out on it. Once you look at the data, it's also easy to understand some of the key things we want to understand. The peak potential jumps out at us pretty quickly. The time to peak jumps out at us pretty quickly. And we can also look at the rate of adoption, whether it was a pretty rapid uptake, more linear, or perhaps an S-shaped curve. So they're great to work with. They're also pretty easy to access the data for. many companies have a variety of secondary data sources. That would include things like new-to-brand data, NRX and TRX data. Many countries use patient days of therapy. You can also look at unit volume or sales-based metrics as well. And the other thing about the data is it's considered low cost because, again, these companies tend to be buying secondary data for other applications. And so we can tap into that as forecasters relatively cheaply. And then the third area is the data are just easy to communicate. It's easy to ingest the data into Excel, create a market share graph, copy that graph and stick it in a PowerPoint presentation. And so it's just very easy to work with. So those are the key benefits and why we like to work with them. But also important is to understand the challenges of analogs. And as we talk to our colleagues, we're always going to hear about why an analog isn't perfect. And so it's good to understand that because it actually helps us work with the analog when we understand what the imperfections are. So I would generally agree with the statement that no two marketing environments are, ever truly the same. And that is a challenge for finding good analogs. That said, even if you did find the, quote unquote, perfect analog, you're looking at a very low sample size. And an N of 1 in our industry is generally considered risky. And so what we want to do is we want to understand these challenges so we know how to work with them, and we can increase that sample size from 1 to something hopefully much higher. So I identified 4 key challenges with analogs: differences in the nature of the disease, differences in the marketing landscape, and I'll put access in that bucket as well, product differentiation, and differences in promotion. So if we look at the nature of the disease, things can be very different. Some diseases are life-threatening, others are acute, others are chronic, and that's going to impact treatment choices. So if we talk about oncology for just a moment, obviously can be a life-threatening disease. And we do see that patients who have cancer, unfortunately, are asked to tolerate side effects that are much worse than someone with, say, diabetes or high cholesterol. Some diseases are preventable or curable or incurable. And again, that's going to affect our choices. It might also affect our analog selection. Some diseases are symptomatic and others are asymptomatic. They might have differences in how patients stay on therapy or comply to their dosing regimen. So typically you're going to want to stay within, a disease that's symptomatic or asymptomatic just because of that patient behavior. Lifestyle choices versus, quote unquote, true medical need could be different. So as I've been in the industry, my forehead's gotten a little bit longer, and there are things that I could take for that, but I choose not to. It's not a true medical need, and so that affects prescribing behavior. Patient comorbidities are going to be different across different diseases. We talk about the cardiometabolic patients sometimes. Other diseases have other diseases that cluster around each other. And so that can make a difference on treatment choices. If we move to differences in marketing landscape, level of unmet need. How similar is this analog's level of unmet need when they launched relative to the unmet need in your market? Typically, the higher the unmet need, the more that correlates to share. Who treats these patients? Different specialists will treat patients differently. And so you'll have to look at your analog to see, well, how did different specialists prescribe, and could that impact the analog at all? Different therapeutic areas obviously are facing different guidelines, and different guidelines will have different impacts on prescribing. Access, also very important. Typically, access only gets tighter as time passes. And so you might want to look at, well, how old is this analog? What were the access conditions when it launched? And what are the access conditions of my product going to be when I launch? And do I think it's going to be harder for me to get share based on potential differences in access? And then there's what we like to call practice economics. In some therapeutic areas, there's a buy and bill model where physicians actually make money when they sell, or the practice makes money when they sell the product to the patient, and that can affect prescribing as well. Third area that we tend to spend a lot of time in when we're looking at analogs is the level of product differentiation. Typical metrics here: safety and efficacy. What's the trade-off between better efficacy versus safety? And how does that line up to, the product that we intend to launch? Eventually, you'll get into things like dosing and convenience. Maybe you're a QD product and the analog is BID. What's the impact of dosing on prescribing choices? Biomarkers can make a big difference because now you're able to give, the right patient the right medicine. And so that can make a difference on share. I threw number of competitors and time between launches in product differentiation instead of the marketing landscape, just because I think it's so closely correlated. But a first or second entrant can make such a big difference versus a third or fourth entrant on share. So can time between launches. The longer a product's on the market unopposed, the more entrenched prescribing becomes. Look at the approval process. Some products launch with a pretty robust data package and others don't. And if you're one of those products that's launching with, a relatively minimal data package and through life cycle management it increases, what's the impact of that on prescribing? And then last but not least, differences in promotion. Look at share of voice. Will your product be promoted with the same share of voice as the analog? With technology today and changing access in physician offices, there's a shift to omnichannel. And so what's that impact, if any? And then look at the role of the patient. Many patients today are very well educated about their disease and they seek out treatments. And so that can have an impact as well. So a lot to know about the different challenges. And not to belabor the point, but it sets us up for a good conversation down the road. McKinsey looked at this and they found a couple of things. One, order of entry is very important. And that was something that we talked about previously. In their study, the average first entrant got about a 40 share, second entrant a 33 share, and third entrant a 19 share. So order of entry can make a big difference, but they also found other factors that led to differences in prescribing. That can be, again, nature of the specialist that's prescribing, the route of administration, the speed in developing indications through lifecycle management activities. And they quantify a lot of this, and that becomes very useful. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So key takeaways from the last two slides. The share drivers are multifactorial, and each factor, as you can see from the graph on the right, carries a little bit of a different impact. But I think the nice thing about knowing what these differences is and what the challenges are is it creates a little bit of a roadmap for us to think about when we choose analogs and when we talk about what our share could be. So let's pick on order of entry. We said that a third entrant is about a 19 share, or McKinsey said that, and the second entrant's about a 33 share, so a 14-point difference. Well, those are averages. You might want to put some bookends around it, maybe a 10 to 20% share difference. And you can use that. So if, for example, you only have second entrants available for what you're looking for, but your product's a third entrant, you can use that gap that McKinsey found as a way to bridge your second entrant analog to your third entrant analog. So that becomes a handy tool, and we'll talk about that some more. But first, we're going to talk about what not to do. What I would caution you to not do, or encourage you not to do, is don't throw away too many analogs. And so some examples, what we just talked about. Don't throw away analogs that aren't deemed close enough. If all you can find are second entrant analogs, but you have a third entrant, you might be able to work with them through that McKinsey style approach that we just talked about. The other thing that I'd really try to encourage you to do is not to throw away analogs that don't have the outcome you want. So we've probably all been in these meetings where we brainstorm analogs and someone says, well, we can't use that because the share is too high or the share is too low. That's really not the metric that you want to base an analog on. The ideal analog, again, this is why we talked about it up front, is one for a similar product in a similar market. And if the shares are deemed, out of bounds for some reason, then again, what I would ask you to consider is that McKinsey style approach and start thinking through, well, what are the differences in that potential analog versus yours? And is there a way to bridge it to something that might make more sense? And then the other thing I'd ask you not to do is not to define the market incorrectly. So we did talk about biomarkers earlier, and there is a narrower population, almost by definition, for that biomarker enriched population. When you look at the shares, make sure it's of that eligible population versus the broader disease category. Otherwise, you might end up with the wrong denominator and the wrong share. We talked about access differences. Are there differences in the level of access that you expect? And can you account for that? And lastly, some of these products have fixed dose combinations, and they span multiple ATC codes. So another way to think of the analog is not just, maybe the share of a particular ATC code. What you might have to do is group ATC codes together and look at the share of the overall molecule in that expanded ATC4 class. Okay. So what should you do? Well, what I'm going to encourage you to do is to try to look at ranges. The way we're going to do that is we're going to start with all of those challenges we just talked about and analyze and identify as many as we can. And then the second thing we're going to do is kind of the theme of today, which is try to bridge that analog to your market. We talked about order of entry. There could be other factors. Maybe your product is more efficacious. Maybe it's safer. If your product is more efficacious than the analog, well, how many share points do you think that's worth? Is it worth 5 to 10? It's a little bit opinionated. I understand that. But you can start to bookend it a little bit on what the value of that might be. You might even have some market research from a conjoint that would say what the impact of efficacy is, or what the impact of having outcomes data is versus no outcomes data. And so it gives you a little bit of a roadmap on how to create that bridge from your analog to where you're at. Once you've done all of that, you can plot those ranges on a nice 2x2 grid, which again, they're simple and everybody likes, they're easy to communicate. We have market share on the bottom axis and the frequency of occurrence on the y-axis. It's essentially a histogram of sorts. And what you're trying to do with this is say, well, where is the range? What's the realm of possibility? And in this illustrative example, the realm of possibility is anywhere from, say, like a 5 or 10 share to maybe a 50 or 60 share. Those are the bookends. And then you can see I've kind of put a median where about half the values have a frequency that's higher than 2 and half have a frequency that's less than 2. And I've done it the other way around as well, that half the analogs have higher than about a 25 share and half the analogs have less. So it gives you some perception of where the risk would be, where the uncertainties are. And so as you're going through this, things you might want to consider is, if you had data from your market research conjoint, where does that fit on this? And what are the ranges within that market research? We talked about in our prior webinar where you could put a range around the market research data. Maybe you've done ad boards and you've talked to scientific leaders about what your share distribution could look like. Where do they fall on this? You may have internal experts, whether it's people on your access team, could be people in research or medical affairs. Where do people internally place this? And that gives you more information to think about where you could be on your share range. The other thing I'd ask you to do is go back and look at the relevance of each of your analogs. That's the elephant in the room, is we always want to say this analog's not relevant enough. Well, how do we work with that? What you could do is create a scoring system where you define all those different categories that are important to you when you evaluate the analog. Could be safety and efficacy, could be order of entry, whatever those attributes are, identify them and assign a weight to each category. Let's just keep it simple and say it's safety and efficacy. Maybe safety has a 40% weight and efficacy has a 60% weight. So you could define on for each analog how they rate on that safety and efficacy score. And you could do this as a team or by yourself and develop consensus on how relevant each analog is across all these different scoring systems. And ultimately, you'll do the math, you'll create the overall score. And again, you can plot everything on a nice 2x2 grid. And so here the x-axis is how relevant it is. 100% relevant means it's that unicorn, that perfect analog that doesn't exist. And then, of course, your share on the y-axis. And so here what we're saying is that as we get more and more relevant, the shares get closer to a 50 or 60% share. Well, that's interesting because if we just flip back to our prior slide for a second, when we looked at this slide, we would have said pretty risky to take that 50 or 60% share because it just doesn't happen that often. But by evaluating the relevance of these analogs, what we're starting to see is maybe that 50 or 60 share is more relevant. Again, I'd want to look at other data sources, but that's a good way to help you triangulate on what a viable share range could be. And so just some closing thoughts. Analogs are extraordinarily powerful tools when you think of how your product's going to penetrate the market. They do have limits, as everything has limits in forecasting, but those limits can be managed. It takes a little patience, a little effort, and a little bit of negotiation with your colleagues, but those limits can be managed and controlled. What do you want to do to get the most out of your analogs? Again, you're not going to want to throw away too many because you're throwing away a lot of very useful information. You're also not going to want to define the market incorrectly because you could end up either deflating or inflating your shares. What I'm going to encourage you to do is look at ranges. And one of the things that you can do once you have those ranges is you can do Monte Carlo analysis on the back end of this because now you have that probability distribution. You can evaluate the relevance of each analog. And because of that, you can start triangulating all your different data sources. And lastly, develop consensus with the team. This is a bit of a negotiation process. And this is a nice way to start bookending what the realms of possibility are and start driving people towards ultimately that one number that you're going to have to pick for budgeting. And it's always, again, nice to know that there's a range and you can run risks and opportunities across that range. But ultimately, we know in the budgeting exercise, we are often forced to pick just that one number. So this is a great way to do that. So it's time for the Q&A. I'll pause briefly. You should be able to hit the Q&A button in the webinar screen. On my screen, it happens to be at the top. I did receive a couple of questions in advance, so while I'm waiting for the Q&As to come in, I'll just try to quickly answer a couple of those. Number one, is it too risky to pick an analog at the far end of the spectrum? Good question. I think by risk here, we're also talking a little bit about uncertainty. When we get to the left and right ends of the spectrum, what we're saying is if we go much further, either end, there's some risk, and financial risk is what people think of. Oh my gosh, if I go all the way to the right, am I going to miss my forecast because I've gone all the way to that far right bookend? Well, in the example I showed, which again was illustrative, that might be a technique to make you more confident about going to that right end of the spectrum. But it might be the right thing to do. The converse of that is, especially at launch, if you're on the far left side of the spectrum and you're wrong because there's a lot more interest in your product post-launch, then you do risk, unfortunately, stockouts at launch. And obviously, you're not going to want to do that. Question number 2. What if the medical doctors on my team believe my product would be used in nearly all patients? Yeah, that does happen occasionally. I think the question here is, can we start thinking of different patient types? Maybe in real world data, you're able to scrape some measurable differences in different patient types. And what you might be able to do from that is offer patient profiles in a market research study. And you could survey doctors and ask them how they would prescribe your product in each of these different patient types. And that might create some information and start some dialogue with the doctors on your team. And then you can start digesting areas of difference of opinion and ultimately what you're going to want to use for your forecast. All right, I don't see any questions coming in on the live screen. So just to close out, don't forget to register for our next webinar. That topic will be, what will my product be used instead of? And we'll address the strategic questions: which competitors am I messaging against? And what share of my target population will I achieve? And of course, we do offer training. There is training next week. There we'll build models that kind of supplement what we've been talking about. And those models will help us think in terms of different ways to model competitive launches and pressure test our forecast. And so with that, I'll thank you for your attendance, and we'll look forward to joining you again on the next webinar. Thank you so much.